Hey, this is Candia Raquel, founder of Centro de Poder. Welcome to the Sensual Sessions podcast. And today we have a very special guest. This is the Thomas Kampe. He's an extraordinary movement researcher. He's a Feldenkrais method teacher. He's a dancer. And yeah, Thomas, welcome. So happy to have you here.
Thank you, Candia, and I feel very embarrassed about your wonderful, glamorous introduction. So it's great to be here in Mexico with you.
Yeah, we're connected. So tell us a little bit about your background. How did it happen that you, being an Aquarius being, decided to devote yourself and your life to dancing and to arts and to movement? Was it a sudden movement?
That's a very interesting question. So I'm originally from Germany. I live in London. I've lived in London since 1986. I grew up in Germany. I was born in 1959. That's a little while ago. So I was born with a parental generation and a kind of older generation around me who came out of the Nazi fascism culture, and my whole hometown was destroyed. So there wasn't really if you had any kind of brain and a bit of an education, it was very difficult to conform, let's put it that way. It was very difficult, to orient yourself as amongst your parents or your parents' peers. So I think I grew up in a context when I was a student. I studied education and visual art, and then went into performance and all these kind of things, where you had to be really radical. You had to be really extremely radical. Everything had to be different, radical from what it was before. We were brought up by left-wing teachers, by left-wing lecturers, in a way under the auspices of Theodor Adorno's education after Auschwitz remit, basically to construct a critical generation, to construct a critical young generation. So, and he called this an education towards maturity.
Yes.
Education towards maturity. So we were brought up with a critical education. So, and as part of that, when I studied pedagogy, we were introduced to anti-pedagogies and embodied pedagogies. And we came across the Feldenkrais method, maybe around 1978 or 1979, as part of kind of critical studies. And I was always a mover. I was always a sports person, but I wasn't very traditionally masculine. I was small. I was very feminine. I was thin. I wasn't interested in the kind of traditional sports culture where you would just get bullied. And I was part of all this, but I would always get bullied. So I had to find something else. And I found theater. I found physical theater, Lecoq-based theater. I found this kind of critical education. I found very strange physical theater practices, which made us move the arms in these kind of spirally ways, and which asked us to move our pelvis, so there was already a lot of Feldenkrais in the Lecoq pedagogy that I came across, and I also came across across Polish theater practitioners like Gadzienici or Grotowski. We worked out in nature and a lot of perception work, and I thought, oh, this is it. And this is how I can find myself. And then in 1982, after working also with a theater company and studying still in Kassel, in Germany, I went to England. I went to England to study theater. And the theater department was full, and they say, why don't you go to the dance department? So I went. I thought, and they said, come here, we need another boy.
Another boy?
And we're improvising, and they did improvisation, and we're working with Laban principles here, German expressionist principles. And everyone's a dancer and improvising and community dance and somehow feeling myself and expressing myself. So expressive pedagogies, and it was really something I had been interested in. It came to me. And I was really involved in kind of live art, what we call now live art, performance art, needing to be a really radical individual artist. And this was all about embodiment and feeling and sensing and communities and working with people. And I thought, wow, this is much more radical, or this is much more suited to what I'm interested in. Just to wind back a little bit, the town where I'm from, Kassel, was bombed during the Second World War, so it was
Devastated.
80% destroyed. We played in the ruins as kids, but there was also something else there, which was called the Documenta. And the Documenta was founded in 1955 to bring the European avant-garde art back to Germany. So I grew up with all these avant-garde artists: Marina Abramovic, Allen Ginsberg, the surrealist. I had lunch as a student with some surrealist artists and Merit Oppenheim and so I came across already as a child across these kind of otherness, across another possibility of expressing yourself, another cultural way of being as an artist, but also as a mover. And that whole thing kind of then led me to studying dance. I went in 1986. I left Germany. I had a fellowship to study dance at the Laban Center. Then we did a lot of Nikolai Lewis based and Hanya Holm based improvising and composition, and I loved it. I just loved it. And I was a crap dancer. I wasn't a very good dancer. I wasn't a very good technical dancer. I'm probably better now, much better now. But I loved that work. I loved that work. And through that, I got involved in studying dance with a man called Scott Clark. And with Scott Clark's classes, I just felt I understood what we're doing. I feel I'm learning. I feel I can. I feel this is really something. It doesn't matter if I'm not doing it well. But I understand something and I learn something and I can something. And of course, he was using the Feldenkrais method and Laban approaches to dance to find kind of phrasing. He talks in hindsight more about that. He was teaching more phrasing, even though he was also teaching embodied technique. And that really shaped me. This approach really shaped me, and I got involved in British kind of new dance ventures and was part of a dance collective. And then I was working for 13 years with a Holocaust survivor choreographer, Hilde Holger. I met her when she was 83 years old.
You met her?
She was really radical. Really? We are doing art here. We are making art here. We are not doing street dance. We don't dance in the street. Yeah? And she was still choreographing and teaching until she was 96 years old. And that was her act of resistance. It was an act of resistance. Hitler had died. Her whole family had died. And she was still in the studio. We carried her to the studio sometimes. She was still in the studio moving or letting us move. She was a disabled woman and playing and improvising and composing with us. And that was an act of resistance. And we understood that.
Yes.
We understood
the
power. She called it the power of dance.
The power of
She
dance.
talked about the power of dance. She has her biography is called The Power of Dance. And you could see that, there was this old 93-year-old woman in the studio, crippled, and when we started dancing, she would just transform in front of us. She would become this erotic creature. So the Eros, the life force, the rest hormones were activated in that 90-something-year-old woman, because we were dancing for her and with her, and we were playing with her, and that still kind of shapes me, that experience from working with Hilde. Important part. And then I went into university teaching. I got in Chichester, and the university was run the department was really run by a radical feminist,
Yes.
Valerie Briginshaw, together with a really wacky co-director, Chris Butler, another fantastic female artist and pedagogue. And they were radical, and they loved me, and they wanted me, and they supported experiment. They wanted a kind of culture like the Dutch school in Amsterdam, where they were doing contact improvisation and somatic practices and release and movement exploration. And at the time, I was quite an established performer. So I was working with some fairly small scale dance companies, but also with a theater company, a Jewish theater company. And we did a lot of plays. I did choreography and performance in plays and for plays, movement direction, also visual design for plays. And we toured them internationally. We toured and the I was playing the Germans and the young Jews as well, so, and we, through that practical work, I had a lot of kudos at the university. So they got a lot of money because that was reviewed and that they could count that as research. So I could get money for, I only fairly late understood that I could get funding from the university. All the other members of staff got it, and then I realized, oh my God, I'm only taking a little bit here. I could take much more. I could ask for more. And so at some point I said, look, you don't have to pay me for any of this research because I'm doing that anyway. But can you pay me to develop my somatic practices? Mm-hmm. So they asked me to run modules like experiential anatomy modules and contact improvisation modules, embodied kind of dance modules. And I would go on courses. They pay for me to train as a Reiki practitioner. I went to Thailand to train in Thai massage. They paid for the Thai massage. They paid for me to do an iTech holistic massage training. I did craniosacral work. I mean, loads of stuff. Batenia. I went to New York to study Batenia fundamentals. And then I decided what I really want to do is to become a Feldenkrais practitioner, because that makes more and more sense to me. And they paid for that. So they paid for the training for most of it. I then left the job in the last year. So since 1999, I've been teaching Feldenkrais in a context of dance and theater education. I did my PhD about the Feldenkrais method as a choreographic resource.
Wow.
Basically saying, look, this is how the Feldenkrais method can work in a practical, choreographic and creative context. So it's not about only body learning and skills development, but this has something to do with creativity.
Yes.
And it has something to do with choreography and creativity. I was proposing, because the Feldenkrais method per se is choreographic. It uses movement, it uses perception, it uses structure, repetition, theme and variation, reversal, problem setting, letting go of problems, constraints, ABA structures, development of ideas, and so on. It uses all the things that I know as a choreography teacher. Yeah, it uses the elements of choreography in order, and the toolkits of a choreographer in order to change people's place in the world and sense of self. So that's kind of
people's place in the world and their sense of self.
Yeah. So, and it activates. It's a process of self-activation, which activates a creative engagement with oneself, if it's done in a good way. And it does that through choreographic means. That's what I was kind of researching and looking at and writing about. And then of course, I had to kind of theorize the work a little bit because I was doing a PhD. So I had to start thinking, well, where does this all come from?
I've read amazing articles from you. Amazing articles from you. Very happy you put down the work of theorizing.
Yeah, and I thought I'm not going to use the classics that everyone was using at the time in PhDs, French philosophers, and I did as well, actually later on. But I just had to find something that had something to do with the systems thinking, where he was coming from. Of course, I was interested in Gregory Bateson. I was interested in Varela. I was interested in all these kind of cognitive, systemic thinkers that I came across. A philosopher called Edgar Morin,
Edgar Morin,
a French ecologist and cinematic theorist and a complexity thinker, and I just fell in love with the pedagogy, and I also fell in love with the ideas of Theodor Adorno, and because that also came from the same period, post-World War II period, a kind of Jewish Renaissance thinking, if you wish, in Europe and the United States, the kind of Frankfurt School of, in the New York School, then kind of rethinking society, rethinking the autonomous individual after a period of totalitarianism.
Yes.
There are many shadow sides to the cyberneticists, and there are many shadow sides to that period in terms of how the CIA was involved in the thinking, and all this artificial intelligence stuff that's happening now was already thought
by the cybernetics in the 70s.
Yeah, by the cybernetics in the 30s, and also in the 40s in the Macy group where Bateson was involved in, and Feldenkrais and Faster. So the people who Feldenkrais kind of knew. Yes. But what was interesting for me was it became clearer and clearer to me that there was a philosophical trajectory there in the work, that it's not just about becoming a better mover and not just about becoming a better person, but a better person for what reason, and what out of what sort of idealism and out of what sort of hope did this work kind of emerge, and what is the hope there today, and what is the philosophical potential for us in the Feldenkrais work or in somatic practices for us today? How can this be meaningful? Yes. And so I did a lot of research kind of going backwards. Yes. Like in archaeology, digging down back to the early modernist roots of the body culture women, particularly, who were very much into liberating women and empowering women through developing holistic, felt, explorative movement practices concerned particularly with activating the pelvis and the core, and of course Martha Graham work emerges from the same place where Feldenkrais to some extent emerges from the work of Bess Menzendieck, the Dr. Bess Elizabeth Menzendieck, who was a health and beauty practitioner who developed a body training system, which really bled into modern dance. She developed this pelvic seesaw, which became the Graham contraction, which becomes the pelvic clock, and so on. So this activating of the pelvis in this dimension very strongly, and empowering and strengthening women's pelvis. And I did some research on the teachers of my teacher, of Hilde Holger, this Jewish old survivor. I did several years of researching into her heritage, into a woman called Gertrud Bodenwieser, an Austrian radical modernist choreographer who left Austria in 1938, went to Colombia, kind of co-pioneered modern dance in Colombia, then went to New Zealand, and then ended up in Australia, more or less pioneering modern dance in a bigger way. And I've been in touch with a lot of her disciples, ex-dancers, ex-students. I've worked with them who were then in their 90s as well. And one of her dancers who's now 107, she danced for me over a cappuccino when she was 103.
She's very, very, very alive.
Very alive, very alive. And so I met all these extraordinary people and these extraordinary women, and I was invited to go to Israel in 2017. Because of the Palestinian issue, I've always avoided Israel, really, even though I've worked in a Jewish context and everything else is Jewish inflected. That I do, I'm not pro-Israel politics, put it that way.
Yes.
Yeah. And in that research period, I met a woman called Yael Barkai, and I was staying in her house for 2 weeks. I was placed in her house, and she's in her 70s, and she's the pioneer of authentic movement and dance movement therapy in Israel. She knew all these people, and it turns out she was a student of a Bodenwieser student. She didn't know that this woman had studied with Bodenwieser, but they also moved the pelvis and they were improvising and all this kind of stuff. So I suddenly discovered there is a whole Bodenwieser legacy in Israel. Now, Bodenwieser doesn't turn up anywhere in the archives. Laban turns up, Wigman, Paluca, all the ones who collaborated with the Nazis turn up. But Bodenwieser doesn't turn up because she went into obscurity in exile.
And you brought it to life. And you're bringing it to life.
Again?
And
I'm bringing this kind of a little bit to life again. So I've written quite a bit about that. And then I discovered that Moshe Feldenkrais had studied in the 1920s modern dance with a woman called Margalit Ornstein.
With a woman.
Yeah, and in the biography written by Mark Rees, there's one sentence about this. In the German biography, there's more about this. And so and wrongly they say he studied ballet with a teacher called Margalit Ornstein. But Margalit Ornstein was not a ballet teacher. She was a Bodenwieser teacher. So she was a Bodenwieser and Menzendiek and Dalcross teacher. So she took the kind of modernist body culture work in the 1920s to Palestine to construct the new Jew, what they were calling the new Jew, the muscle Jew. The Jew is free in the body, the Jew is physical, the Jew is not only intellectual, the Jew is not a victim, the Jew who's creative, the Jew who's free. So they were interested in constructing a Zionism through embodiment, through intelligent embodiment. And so they did this experimental reform gymnastics and dance there, and Feldenkrais studied that. And at the heart of that work was moving the pelvis. Moving the pelvis. So there is a whole legacy of women teachers in Feldenkrais's and women influences in Feldenkrais's legacy, which then I wrote an alternative history about. And so I was just blinking a little bit out all the other male genius martial arts legacy, and I started to look at these women who had been not written into history.
Not written into history.
Not written into history. I was going to say written out of history, but they simply hadn't been written into history.
Worse, ignored.
And so I.
Yeah. So.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you were saying.
Yeah, these women were ignored from history.
They were.
Well, they were actually like the trunk and the roots of a magnificent tree. And it's like you say, it's not only like the big, even macho-like martial artist, very powerful, but at the very core of the Feldenkrais method is sensitivity. And not only like emotions, but like through physical and emotional and like the sensitivity that involves the whole of yourself, also in an erotic way, like a hunting tiger, like this sense of self as flesh, and it's
And I always call
like,
it
yeah,
I always call it a fleshy sense of self.
a fleshy sense of self.
I always talk about a fleshy sense of self. Yeah, and you know, I talked a lot to Yael Bar-Kai and also to the granddaughter of Margaret Ornstein and all these older women, and Sophia Naharin, the mother of Ohad Naharin, about the period. And
The mother of the father of
what is
Gaga.
very clear is that
Super nice. Yeah.
what's very clear is that during that period, and when Feldenkrais developed his work in Israel, there were maybe 300 or 500, up to 500 modernist gymnastic people in Israel who came from Europe, who were refugees. And there was a village where Yael Bakai came from, or her father came from, which was called the Village of Love,
The village
where
of
they were practicing the village of love, and they were practicing love. They were practicing free love, but not only erotic love, but the school was all about love. The culture was about love. There were up to 300 Gindler pedagogues, Gindler trained pedagogues in Israel. And I know that Feldenkrais worked very closely in the beginning with a woman called Lotte Christella. Lotte Christella was one of the leading Gindler pedagogues. And Gindler's work is all about organic learning. Gindler's work describes what Feldenkrais later on appropriates as organic learning. She describes that already in the 1930s, the organism exploring the world and creating its identity through movement and through exploration in its environment. And we need to kind of replicate that and use that as an explorative format. So it became, I mean, I had a conversation with a colleague, I've forgotten his name, and it's terrible, a wonderful pianist, Feldenkrais colleague, and he came to one of my lectures and he said, oh, this is amazing, this is the only thing that ever makes sense. Yeah, because it doesn't make sense that Feldenkrais, it makes a little bit of sense that Feldenkrais is a judo man and talks, suddenly comes from judo to a humanist pedagogy. Yeah, within a few years, he doesn't talk about judo so much anymore, but he uses the language that these humanist embodied pedagogues were using. He talks about organic learning. Uses all that psychology that they were using. And so he was surrounded by a whole uterus, so to speak, of female knowledge, which was excluded from the narrative. And I know that he was to some extent very rude to these women, that he was laughing about them, that he was disrespectful, and he was, you know, they were just his lovers. And who are these women? I mean, he was in Israel a big shot. He was a famous guy. He was a big guy, you know, and it was a very, very patriarchal society. And these women, they were women, and they were pedagogues. That's another low status. They were gymnastic pedagogues, and they were refugees. They were losers. They were not Israeli. They were people who ran away from Europe. They were not fighters like him. You know, he was a boxer and stuff. So they had a low status. These German-speaking women who were survivors who fled Europe or came a little bit after the Second World War. And who were just movement pedagogues. You couldn't make much money with them. You couldn't make yourself become famous with that. You could make yourself become famous with making the prime minister stand on his head.
Yeah, great marketing.
Yeah. So it's fascinating to kind of do this kind of research and try to put a kind of feminist lens on it.
Yeah.
And I've just won a little scholarship to go to Israel again and to Germany and to research a particular pedagogue who I've discovered there, who left Germany in 1933. There's a fantastic collection about her work in the Tel Aviv Dance Library. So I will go there and hopefully be able to copy that and also work a little bit in in the Berlin library. So that's kind of one trajectory that I kind of went back to the kind of modernist roots, to some modernist roots. There are other roots. And I've written quite a bit about that in relationship to the Bodenwieser legacy, the modern dance legacy, but also to the somatic legacy, Feldenkrais, but also other somatic practices. And then I'm also more broadly involved in a kind of somatic study and somatic research, and I've got a little bit involved into the whole I've got quite a lot involved in a field that we would call today critical somatics.
Critical somatics.
Critical somatics. So a call. There were two people who kind of influenced me there in the thinking. A woman called Isabelle Ginot, who's a French Feldenkrais person, but also philosopher and social worker. And she talks about she makes a kind of call to radicalize the work, to articulate the radical potential and to articulate the politics and the political potential of the work. And particular, I took from it, with a lot of conversations, as I'm part of a research journal, and also I'm really interested in kind of critical somatics, in looking at the critical potential of that. So I worked with other colleagues to articulate that and to write about this, and I was part of Body IQ Festival Berlin, of the organizers, several times to look at creating communities who are interested in this discourse on critical somatics. How can somatics be a field that puts things into question, and not only personal things, but perhaps also social things into question?
Yeah, how the personal body intertwines with the social body,
with the social and the political body. And what's missing in our practices that allows us to do that, and how can we develop the practices to have more cultural potential, culturally transformative potential. The second person, and again, my brain's not very good today, I'm a bit tired. Let me just think who, Rhiannon, I think she's called Rhiannon with her first name Anderson. A woman who I have never come across again. She writes a dissertation. She writes a handbook for critical somatics.
Wow.
Which is unfinished. It's an unfinished document. You find it on the internet. You can download it for free. And so she writes a whole concept on critical somatics. So that really kind of helped me along on the way as well. I think this is a direction that we can perhaps formulate and articulate as a kind of field, and as part of that, I've been more now recently involved in ecosomatics, in somatics and ecology and eco-consciousness, partially because I've always felt that the Feldenkrais method, the philosophy at least, is a kind of ecological approach. It's not necessarily an anthropocentric approach.
Yes.
It's not the Martha Graham. It's not Pilates. We don't have we don't necessarily have a center, but we're part of something. We're part of a fundamental unity of the body, mind, and environment. So in that way, we were closer to the Nikolai approach or Holm approach, that we're part of a bigger system. And there is a center in us that allows us to navigate. That's the nervous system. That's our creativity. That's our psyche, if you wish, or our enfleshed psyche. But we're not so much interested in constructing a center in ourselves. I think in the Feldenkrais method, we're very much interested in flexibility and adaptability and connectivity to the world. The social world, of course, too. He writes about that. He also writes about the sexual world. He was a sex addict, so he writes about that. And never mind, we all, in one way or another. And he gives us a fantastic starting point to think about this kind of what he calls a unity. It's unity of body, mind, and environment unity. So that kind of
Yes.
led me easily also to look at ecological approaches to embodiment and embodied approaches towards understanding ecology and biology. I was quite close to a eco-critique person called Wendy Wheeler. Unfortunately, she passed away. Wendy wrote two fantastic books. One is called The Whole Creature. It's about biosemiosis, how nature communicates, how we're communicating, and that really kind of I felt was a very interesting framework to understand somatics. That would be a whole other kind of now research task to knit those fields together, to look at biosemiosis in relationship to and Wheeler's work and other people's work in relationship to somatics and Feldenkrais. I brought Wendy to a conference that I was running about Feldenkrais and creative practice, but her presentation was a bit confused. It didn't really land. I don't think she understood somatics, so she didn't know what to talk about in that way. But never mind. And the other book she wrote is called A New Modernity, where she just kind of circumvents all the kind of postmodern theories, but she goes into something that she calls neo-modernism. And where I began to understand that a lot of the kind of release techniques that we've been doing with Mary Fulkerson and others, that they really have a neo-modernist attention. Yeah, she says, I think modernism tried to bring culture back to nature, and neo-modernism tries to integrate nature back into culture. And so I found this all very interesting. And then I was approached to edit a whole journal on ecosomatics and somatics and ecology. And I said, I'm really not an expert enough in this. I need to get some colleagues on board. And I got Katja Münke on board from Berlin, who runs a kind of environmental somatics training program. She's a lovely colleague, and we've had lots of discussions on politics and the more than movement and more than person aspect of Feldenkrais' work. And I got Jamie McHugh on board. Jamie McHugh, who lives in the United States. He's an ex-Anna Halprin person who has a kind of human nature kind of resourcing approach to embodiment. And we had a fantastic time editing this journal. Wow, it was just so exciting.
Delightful.
Really exciting. Really nice. And we had scholarly articles, we had practitioner reflections, plus artworks. We had videos in the journal, we had poetry, we had visual artworks, photographs, and so on. And really looking at how can we respond to this madness that we're living in. I mean, I'm colored by the Holocaust from my childhood.
And I want to ask you about how can we navigate and have something emerge out of this madness. And I want to ask you about the sense of self, like having born in Kassel, having been part of a Jewish legacy and playing in the ruins and growing up in Germany that still has horrendous aftermaths of the Nazi mentality. And you were lucky to be in contact with brilliant people, very radical creators of the future from their pure sense of self, like the avant-gardes and the surrealists. So I want to ask you about how to bear the unbearable. Like I cannot even imagine what it is to be in your shoes. Like I have my struggles as a Mexican woman. Situation is horrible for women in Mexico, but like how, with the background of the past, the weight of the past, the society you grew, how could you bear like the unbearable, and still like how do you feel about what had happened, what still is happening and going in the world, without having that canceling all the great things in you, and actually like you, in your sense of self, there's much to life. Like there are people that have gone to trauma, horrible situations, and they are not dead, but they are not alive either. They are not like your teacher that was 93 years old, and this glorious dancer lady that is 107 years old, and she talks about the power of dance and the resistance. So yeah, I want to ask you about this, the erotic that has no age, this power of aliveness that is the way that I feel that ultimate reality is built on, but it's also like ephemeral. Like I'm trying to put in words something that can only be sensed.
Gosh, I mean, I'm a very happy person, you know. I've been very blessed. I mean, I live a very strange life, you know. I've been single for a long time. My partner lives in Budapest. She's disabled. You know, she has health problems. I have had health problems, and so on. So there's a lot of things which are not normal and not right. But then that's life, yeah. But I'm very blessed. You know, I've been able to find this a beacon of hope. I've been able to hone into creativity, to work through embodiment and creativity with people, with older people who were my teachers, my mentors, with peers, with younger people, trying to transmit the work downwards and forwards, and that's more difficult. That's maybe the most difficult thing, and I'm not so much involved in this anymore. I've just retired from my permanent teaching job because at some point the students are getting younger, I'm getting older. They're not interested in these conversations that we're having now, and I'm just too tired to now attend to their needs, you know. And I'm rich. My life has been rich in a way that's been more than extraordinary. That I've been able to. At some point, there was a kind of intellectual orgasm there, yeah. So where I just had to just churn out things, and things grew and things develop, and you know, and now I'm calming down after that. In my kind of menopausal post hormonal state. So, um, what can I say? So I've been really blessed, you know. And sometimes I wish I had a better life and I could do more and I had more success, but it's really brilliant. I've had a brilliant life, and I have brilliant relationships with my family, with my brothers, with my partner, with my friends. I have really been able to move from a personally fairly traumatized and culturally traumatized place into a a person who's not perfect, but who communicates, who perceives, who feels. I'm present every day in my life, and I have extraordinary things that I do every day, and sometimes they're very boring, but they interest me, and I have an interest in my life. So that's one thing. So and a big part of that has been the Feldenkrais method, has been dance, movement and dance. Really and just being and 40, 50 years of nearly 50 years of creative dance
Yes.
being, and letting that through the Feldenkrais work, letting that also become my own tuning practice, my own transformative practice, my own grounding practice, my own opening practice, my own questioning practice, my own regenerative practice. And then having been part of an intellectual field that is interesting and wants to look critically at the world and wants to make change and feeling that I have a little voice in that. That's very touching. I mean, I've published a book together with my brother on critical pedagogies, yeah, and together with my brother in a very personal way. He talks about design. He was a design professor. I talk about embodiment and movement, and I was an embodiment professor, yeah, and we're collaborating together on on the personal and on a personal and political level. I've been very blessed to have that journey and to have a flow in that.
Yeah. So movement
That's one.
and
That's one
community.
thing. Yeah, movement and community, absolutely. But also, the journey, and I've written about, and I'll send you the article. I'm not allowed to really send it officially. I can, because it's published. Um, a big transformative situation for me was to work with this Jewish theater company with Julia Pascal and doing a Holocaust trilogy and performing and rehearsing and playing and exploring tragedy and my own cultural tragedy and the Holocaust tragedy and you know embodying being a Nazi.
Ah,
I learned to enjoy that. I learned that you can learn that. I learned that it doesn't take long to beat a Jew. It's at first you are afraid and you don't want to do it, and after a while they say, "Come on, just do it, go for it, and have no fear, and you know, do it. You do it." You know, I learned that I can. I learned that I can be a monster, and in that, and I had to kind of face that, and I had to perform that abyss for a long time and work with that cultural abyss. And I met many Holocaust survivors, Auschwitz survivors, and other people, traumatized people, and I had eye-level conversation and dialogue, and even on stage, hand holding, and worked with 90-year-old people who took them by the hand and took them through a dark basement somewhere, where I did the site-specific piece on Second World War heritage, and we all cried. They cried, I cried. And then they say, how can you do this? How can you make a piece like this? How can you do this kind of artwork? I could only say, I wish I couldn't. But I can. I can because I know I have the knowledge. I have
yes.
the knowledge of my cultural heritage.
And you say it's easy. It's not that hard to be a monster, to become a monster, and
Easy.
that's right
I
there.
learned that's one of the things that I learned. That's
Yeah,
one of the things that I learned.
right there lies our humanness or lack of thereof. As Nietzsche said, like if you look into the abyss looks back into you. And
Yeah.
beware of fighting with monsters because least you become one. So yeah, like you went to the shadow, but it's the shadow of us, of all humanity. We have
Yeah.
as a humanity great things, but we have this point of losing it and becoming a monster that like it's at the reach of your hand. So the question that is very interesting is how the sense of self plays. Ha- like what to which point are you willing to give away yourself into and get the sense of being and becoming a monster.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, obviously, this thing, this theatrical experience and this work experience. I mean, this was in a sheltered environment. This was in a coded environment, if you wish, safe environment where we would play, where we would explore, where we would work with each other, and there was a meta level, of course, of intergenerational work. There was a meta level of intercultural work, of reconciliation, and which I think to some extent, maybe Julia and I, we should write, the director who I work with very closely, we should write about that actually more explicitly. We have written about this, what perhaps the bigger journey was as a cultural meeting. That was a very powerful, transformative, therapeutical experience for me. How can I, of my generation, being German, how can I inhabit my powerful masculinity, my physical, powerful, aggressive masculinity without being destructive? How can I learn to, and that was just not possible for me, perhaps before that. Yeah. How can I grow from a boy into a man, into a German man that is a good man?
That is a good.
And whatever that means, how can I move into becoming a big, strong person and a loud and strong person as I can be now, without needing to be destructive, without needing to see this as this is something dangerous, this is something destructive, this is something that has to do with killing, with Nazi, with same. In many ways, this is then also related to my sexuality, my sexual identity. All of that was touched upon through that. Then comes the Feldenkrais work. Then also I did quite a few years of therapy too. I did at some point. I thought I've learned to crawl again. I've learned to feel things in my body again. But I also need to have the language. I need to
have the language.
Sit with someone. I need to have the language and I need to be loved. I need to be loved. Yeah, I need to be loved, and that's. I was just thinking about this recently. What was a core experience of as an adult person in therapy? The experience that you can be loved.
The experience of being loved.
Yeah, that you can be loved in a kind of motherly way from the therapist. That you can be accepted. There's your time for you to talk about yourself. This is for you. This is for you. This is the time for you. And then there are many other things in the therapy, but this fundamental thing that there's the time that perhaps you didn't have as a child or as an adolescent that stopped far too early, that you were listened to with love.
Yes.
Was an incredible experience for me. And on top of everything else, on top of this turbulent journey with theater and very deep journey with embodiment, that was very healing and grounding, and I feel I'm very resilient.
You are.
I feel I'm very resilient in having had to cope with many crises in the last few years, and so it's all okay. I'm blessed, and I'm just another person. Like there are many people who have to kind of cope with much more diabolical, difficult things than I have had. I've had my share, and I still have, and I know how to be resilient, and I know how to love in a way. And
you know how to love, but you also have learned how to be loved.
Yes.
And I don't know which one is harder, because you mentioned about being listened by a therapist in a loving way. And for me, that listening, when I first tapped into it on a Feldenkrais lesson, like, forget about lovingly, just like being listened. And the first that listened to myself was me. It was devastating. I was like, when is the warm-up gonna start? We need to do some crunches because we're gonna dance or move. And the first week I was going crazy, like, we're just here lying down, like at what time something is happening. And I now, as I listen to you, I realize that what really began there was developing my ability to be listened, starting with myself. And it was too much. Actually, it was 2 weeks, and it was such a gentle, almost subversive and coveted dismantling of an unsensitive sense of self that I had, especially from my scientific background, that I had no emotions and no feelings, and actually, I was not an I. I was a conglomerate of molecules and circumstances with a name and legal documents that was biodegradable because entropy don't forgive. And yeah, so this sense of self has to do with awareness, with attention, to listening. And there, something even scarier starts to take appearance, that is aliveness. Like this, like, oh, I am at the edge of not knowing what's going to happen in the next second. And that is very, very, very real. Like being in the cliche here and now. And I wonder if that has something to do with the erotic that you mentioned.
Well, I mean, the erotic I mentioned in this one article, you know, Eros and inquiry, the Feldenkrais method as a complex resource, which was about a lot of it was about actor training, you know, and where we think, okay, so what does the Feldenkrais method offer in a kind of actor training context? And of course, it offers a tool for inquiry. You know, it is really a tool for self-inquiry. It is a process that you are learning actually to engage, to have a process for yourself of self-inquiry, of self-care, of self-tuning, of self-questioning. It's yeah, and then there's something changing in you through that. But you're learning a process. You're learning to inquire, and I think that's very useful for the actor, for a researcher, for a dancer, for anyone. But the other thing, of course, that an actor needs to be in touch with their intuition, their instincts, and their sexuality and their eros.
Yes.
In the broadest way, as we all do. In the broadest way, perhaps when I came across Audre Lorde's writings, you know, the Black American feminist writer, who wrote about the erotic as power.
Yes.
And the eros as our life force, as our vitality, attached or detached from sexuality, it goes beyond sexuality, or the way we perhaps are as babies or as childs, that we scream and we are delighted like about things, and we're uninhibited in the flesh, and we sense and feel, and we're alive. What you say, the kind of aliveness, and of course, you know, the work needs to unpack that. The work, and I think one of the reasons Feldenkrais developed this work, he talks about somewhere about unconditioning. You know, we need to we need to uncondition ourselves first in order to recondition ourselves.
Yes.
And we are all victims of a repressive society and repressive cultural contexts. And so that needs to be unconditioned. And we need to come back to our natural or more organic, to perhaps a more erotic sense of self first. And then channel that and condition that and culture that the way we want to culture it. I think that's part of the work. What I see today in terms of, I mean, I'm very pessimistic. I'm super pessimistic. You know, I mean, I'm shocked. You know, I mean, as I said, I come from this kind of Holocaust trauma, Second World War thing. I've gone through that. I've touched that. That used to be the biggest thing for me. But now, what's in front of us is as big, if not bigger. That's global. There's a global barbarism. You know, Theodor Adorno talks about the principle of Auschwitz, the principle of destruction, the principle of barbarism. And you know, if you're living with an intelligent vision on the world and with open eyes and with an open heart, then the cultural global tendencies of how we're destroying our planet and how we're engaging with each other and how oppressive hierarchies and colonial hierarchies and so on go on in different ways, in more sugar-coated ways or in digital ways, in mediatized and digitized ways. But we are disembodying our world more and more. And there are people who write about, you know, the age of disembodiment and the need for a re-embodiment of the world, and embodiment meaning a felt, sentient, intelligent, reflective sense of being alive, and that you know that Western culture over the last 1,000 years has been entirely devoted to disembodiment of life forms and developing extractive colonialist technologies and economical models, but these don't change. We're not changing these, and we are, you know, if you are listening to the news, then, you know, last week the UN and many other world leading scientists said we have very little chance left now to save the planet. There's very little. It is the final warning. That is a short chapter in the newspaper, and it disappears the next day or a week later. This is not. And all we're hearing in the UK is about immigrants. You know, we're hearing that there's absolutely nothing done in this country where I live politically to attend to the urgency of global climate changes, of ecological catastrophe, of change in an economy and technology that would allow us to live a more civilized life. Nothing, absolutely nothing happening.
Everything for the sake of business.
Business and the wrong type of business.
Yeah, for business as usual. We are just accelerating the sixth mass extinction that, in contrast with the previous five, this is the fastest. Like the T-Rexes and Brontosaurus and dinosaurs, they didn't die from one day to the next, nor in the lapse of a century. That was an extinction that ran a long time. And the problem with this extinction is that it's so fast paced that species are not getting enough time to evolve to feed on pollution. And
yeah.
we are the main force of geological change. And
Absolutely.
surprisingly enough, from all the species, we are the most vulnerable and dependent on the rest of them. Because Lynn Margulis, that was my mentor, she said, like, Gaia was a tough bitch. Like, before, like, in the beginning of times, this was full of meteorites and asteroids and volcanoes exploding. So bacteria will prevail because they can stand, like, being in the hardcore methane or temperatures or everything. But we are so fragile. And seems that we are immersed on a cultural education of walling ourselves from our sense of self. walling ourselves from the sensitivity of our own vulnerability that is the base to perhaps see and listen to the other, because the other is as fragile as you are, and that we are not truly independent. We are actually fully community dependent on
Yeah.
ourselves, on the other, on the fellow neighbor, on the fellow caterpillar over there. So then the words of your teacher are resonating to me. The power of dance and resistance. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the power of dance and the power of resistance and the power of embodiment and re-embodiment is are really important. I mean, I've just stepped out of teaching young people, and one of the reasons is that I feel I can't hold that space. I can't hold that educational space anymore because 40% of my students have mental health or learning disabilities. They have so many problems. There's so much and fear and the nutrition, the sense of embodiment is so out of place, and their whole life ambition is is with this little machine, and there's already a digital childhood, and now we're moving into artificial intelligence, and this is a madness. This is a toxic madness that, as an act of resistance, certainly coming back and honing into and celebrating and loving and cultivating our simple sense of being embodied,
Yes.
of kindly being embodied, and
Kindly
to
being
experience that, yeah, and being unworlded,
worldly.
the unworlded. Wendy Wheeler talks uses that. She borrows it from someone else. Embodied and unworlded. And I mean, today I hardly went out of the house, and someone, I'm going to take the car drive to the park, and I'm just going to go, and I'm just going to look at that tree, and I'm just going to do my movement, and I'm just going to breathe, and and I have the practice. I have a practice to be alive and to tune myself, and I watched some animals and just to be with
Yes.
this. And
Yes.
there is so much in terms of post-humanism in philosophy and in biology and in thinking. There's so much knowledge around in terms of how we need to step out of the toxicity of humanism, the toxicity of capitalism, of course, and you know, we need to change, and we need to change our thinking, and we need to change our sensibility and sensitivity and our interaction, as long as there's still life on this planet. I mean, there is not much life left. There are not many creatures left. Not many insects around. Not many insects in my garden. There are not many. Just you drive around in the car, and there used to be, in the 1990s or 80s, they used to drive around, and you drive in the summer, and you have insects all over your windscreen. You can drive for a whole week, and there's one insect now on your windscreen, because pesticides have
Think,
erased everything. And
things are changing fast. And
they're
they,
changing too fast, and they're changing not only too fast for us, but they're changing too fast for other creatures who cannot adapt that way. And
yes.
it's our making. It's our making. I mean, I was just reading. I had for a book, I had to read a translation by a wonderful colleague called Raquel, who's an ecosomatic thinker and practitioner from Italy, and talks about the grief, and the impossibility to grieve about all of this, and the eco catastrophe, and our colonial heritage in destroying the world, the natural world. And I was thinking about this earlier on, that I kind of disagree with him. I don't think the problem is that we have an inability to grieve. I think most people don't even know that there is something to grieve about.
Exactly.
Most young people don't even know that people will grieve when that's gone, when they don't get a new iPhone, they are grieving, yeah, or when that Netflix series is finished, they're grieving. Yeah? So when these cultural mediated virtual items are missing, there's grief, but there isn't really an understanding anymore in many of us, um, that we have a lot to grieve about, and that we have a loss to grieve about, which is the loss of our natural habitat and
Yes.
our own destructiveness. That is something we need to face, and we need to find a way of clarifying that and bringing that into the foreground again.
Yes. Getting in touch with reality.
Yeah.
Not the untouchable reality of the discourses that sustains the projected image of the self of our modern culture that is deprived and alienated to the flesh, from the flesh, and from the erotic. Because I in TikTok I saw a video of a guy talking about um, artificial intelligence and the robots, and how, if they are not already happening, like you can custom made your lover that reminds your preference and everything. And he was like, yeah, and men can be pretty damn visual. And I was like this guy haven't felt anything in his flesh like for a long time, if ever. And it's like this is a flat screen, and yeah, it's very soft, but that's as far as it goes. So it would seem like very not erotic, but like you have the car, the babe, the boat, the vacations in the Bahamas.
Yeah, yeah.
It would seem that that's super hot and sexy, but like when people finally arrive to the Bahamas and has like the super hot wife or trophy husband, or whatever, and they find themselves at the piece of furniture of the truth that is the bed, like what happens, like what what's gonna happen when you face the flesh that you actually are. So it has many layers of this connection, and at the same time, like I have a little like this fire of hope, very stubborn and rebel inside. And great things, unimaginable things have happened. Like the work of our teachers, like the work of your teachers, and now I learn from you, and they are also my teachers that pass on. So I would like to ask you if you could share with us a little bit more about that fire, a little bit more about how to, like you say, have a practice of being alive. Can be an exercise, an image, a something, an ATM.
Yeah, okay. So let's do a little thing.
Practice of being alive.
So maybe we can just do something in sitting, if we come to sitting, and just find our feet on the floor. Where are your feet? We're just taking stock and see whether we have a good relationship to the ground. What's our relationship to the ground? If you send your attention downwards into your feet, and just not only your attention, but your ability to change that. If you're not comfortable, can you make yourself look more comfortable in the way you're sitting? Can you check whether you're comfortable? And how do you know that? Maybe close your eyes for a minute. And then also notice your whole legs and the image that you have from your feet upwards into your ankle joints, into your knees, into your thighs, then into your pelvis and your relationship to the seat through the pelvis. Let your attention just travel around your pelvis, the sitting bones, your pubic bone in the front, your pelvic floor, your genitals and your anus, your sacrum, your sits bones, your trochanter area on the outside of the thighs, the whole base. Just see what arises from this sense of being rooted, the sense of being rooted through our pelvis, into our legs, into our knees, into our ankle joints and feet, to the ground. And then just put both hands on your tummy and just see what it's like to have your hands on your tummy. I just invite your breathing. Would you allow your breath to expand your abdomen into your hands? Perhaps this breathing can bring more of your aliveness into your organism, into the middle of your organism. Imagine the breath coming through your nose or mouth, through your throat, into your lungs, and compressing your diaphragm down to allow your belly to expand. You might even want to imagine that you can breathe into your lower back. Your back can expand. And then very gently just roll your pelvis a little bit backwards and forwards in this pelvic seesaw on the chair. You are rolling a bit backwards over your sitting bones and then coming forwards and a bit forwards and down again. But mainly backwards and down and forwards and up mainly. And notice how does this affect your knees? How does this affect your feet? Are they completely quiet or do the bones and muscles and tissues shift around it? You might want to soften your belly and push out your belly a bit to help this movement. When would you become taller and when would you become smaller? And then what's a comfortable place somewhere in the middle where you're not too tall, not too small? And then take a moment just to sit again. To let go of the hands, maybe put your hands on your knees and your thighs and see how you're sitting. A few times test this, rolling back and forth from your pelvis again, maybe your hands on your thighs. Perhaps that clarifies a bit more how your whole legs belong into that middle. Would you come back to the middle and gently lift one heel off the floor and bring it back down? Lift one heel off the floor and bring it back down. And can you feel, would you lift one heel and then the ball of that foot a tiny bit off the floor as well and bring them back down? What does this do to your placement of the pelvis? Do you become taller or smaller when you do this? Does your weight in your pelvis shift a little bit more to the right or to the left? How does my relationship to the ground influence how I feel in my middle? Come back to let that go and just notice the differences in the two sides of your pelvis to sitting bones. Are you grounded on the right? Are you grounded on the left? And then lift the other heel a bit off the floor. Just to disturb your balance a little bit. How does that influence and affect the shift of the weight in the pelvis, even in your whole spine? When would you breathe in? When would you breathe out? Lift the whole foot a little bit. Then just come back to the middle. Roll a few times your hips back and forth. What's the feeling of and quality of this rolling? You might, what if you were to push into with one foot into the floor a little bit? What if you were to press a bit with one foot into the floor and then let go of the pressing? How would that move? How would this kind of stepping into the floor move your hips? Right under the other foot, how would that relating to the ground influence your movement? Allow yourself to be moved through your movement. That's great. Come back to the middle. Now put one hand on your tummy and one hand on your chest and just feel the warmth of your hands. Just enjoy that fleshiness, the liveness of your hands. And a kind and caring touch, allowing your spine, your lungs, your organs to rest behind your hands. And roll your pelvis a little bit backwards and forward. And you notice the relationships here between the hands. When your pelvis is rolling forward, what happens in the relationship between the two hands? When your pelvis is rolling backwards, what happens in the relationship between the two hands? At some point, the hands come closer together. At some point, the hands move further apart. Could you activate both hands in doing this? Could the chest hand also become an active player in this opening and closing of our middle? Could you keep the pelvis relatively still and just move the chest hand to lift and lower the sternum, your breastbone? And what would you like to do with your head? Maybe you can let your head go down a bit and rise up. And then activate the pelvis again. Bringing those two hands together. You might want to change your head. Could you do this all slightly wrong? Could you twist yourself a little bit and untwist yourself while you're doing this? Could you do this in the wrong way? Each time you're doing this, become making yourself smaller and then allowing yourself to expand in slightly different ways. And then take the hand that's on the tummy and put it on top of the head. Take the hand that's on your belly and put it on top of your head, and would you begin to activate something in the two hands? And how does this encourage the head to move up and down? And if the head rises, how would that move the whole spine? Could you invite the whole spine to move? Could you allow the pelvis to roll backwards and the head to go down and forwards? Could you allow the head to come upwards and the pelvis to roll forwards? We'll try the opposite of this. Could you twist yourself while you're doing this? Could you let this become a whole little dance exploration? What if you were to become more circular or shifting a bit to the side? Could you think of these three places, the sternum, the chest, the head, and the pelvis, having a little trialogue together? Change hands around. Change your hands. And allow yourself to open also the sides of the ribs and your back. And you could even push into your feet. Could you make this a glorious moving, fluid playful exploration. The hands maybe begin to circle or shift. Don't take the hands away and just have a little snake-like, undulation-like movement through your spine, making yourself small in your front so the back can expand, or making yourself open in your front so the back can strengthen, or shifting your weight more onto one seat. How soft are those ribs? In our colonial heritage language, we talk about a rib cage. How can we undo this rib cage and allow the ribs to become soft, caring, spongy structures? And then just come for a moment to a quiet place in sitting. Take a moment just to test rolling the pelvis back and forth again. Has anything changed in the way you notice the quality of this movement? And which other parts of you are invited in this movement? It's happening in your relationship to your base, to your ground, to your feet. And just come to sitting again and take a moment just to look into your inner space. What sort of fleshy sense of self that we constructed in sitting? Sort of comfort with that feeling, what sort of ease with this feeling? How can you inhabit your full height, width, volume? And then gently turn your head from side to side. Your neck can be just as free as the rest of you. If you're turning a bit more, what would you do in your ribs if you wanted to really look at someone who, if there's someone coming through the door and you really like that person, how would you move your heart and your ribs into the spiral? And then invite your shoulders and ribs to come with you into this spiraling, and open your eyes to do this. Continue this movement in this spiral, but keep your head front and keep your head still like an owl in the middle. Just move your shoulders back and forth. One shoulder goes back, one shoulder goes forward. Would you just as if you've gone for a slow walk, slow motion walk? Would you turn your head the opposite direction? As if you wanted to make a fist in the heart, like the average civilized person, and then you're releasing that fist, and then you're turning your head the opposite direction again. Then you find the limit and breathe a bit into this limit, and then let that go. Good. And then just come back to sitting and just look around you a little bit, see what you're seeing beyond the screen. And how do you take your inner self, your inner space outwards into the outer space? Is that a good thing? So we finished that here.
I'm speechless. the the fleshly, the reality, the ultimate reality of fleshly sensing took over the words and the discourse and everything. Isn't it fabulous to be alive just like that?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Like, you don't need anything. Chocolate, applications in the phone, not like
Yeah, of course, of course, of course.
Yes. Yeah, it's fascinating. Like
I think one of the things that I've learned from the theater, working with theater pedagogues, is the notion of play.
the notion of
Yeah?
play.
The notion of play, yeah, as a word and as an attitude towards engaging with these practices. So they can become often very religious or very mechanical the way we're trying to do them correctly or something. And also in the dance, you know, when you come from a dance background, you never use the word play. You need to be really special and intense or truthful or you know, not even that. I mean, not even truthful, yeah, but maybe expressive or some. But in theater, you have this language of truthful and play and I
Yeah,
think, yeah, this is actually there's a lot, just there's a lot that opens up for us again, you know.
yeah.
And I've just been doing a workshop with a wonderful colleague called John Petter, who works in a process called deep listening,
Deep
which was
listening.
developed by deep listening developed by a composer called Pauline Oliveros, who was a American Portuguese composer in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And she developed this kind of self-care practice, an artistic self-care practice, deep listening. And he used a lot of these things, this playfulness and play with this and we combined this with Feldenkrais and dance, and it felt we had 20 people in the room, and it was just from the beginning to the end, the whole day, it was like toddlers. We were like 2-year-olds. We were just making noises, we were moving, it was just joyful, we were just doing these funny things and faces and moving. There was no meaning, there was no sense, but that was really important to, you know, to come back to this kind of primal fleshiness, but also the sense of play.
Sense of
Yeah.
play.
So where
Curiosity.
sense of play, where the time is suspended in the work, as it is in the Feldenkrais method, that time to achieve something and to perform something and to adhere to something is suspended. We have time to explore, and in that way we just have time to play, and we have time to vocalize, to taste, to feel, to sense, and so on. So we have the fleshiness combined with the playfulness, and I
Yes,
think that's very, very healing and very rich.
very healing and very into the now. You know, of course, I've I've always sensed like my the temperature of my body, but like I was this close to crying because this is the first time in my life that I felt my warmth. Like, yeah,
Mm.
because it's not the same. Like, ah, yeah, I don't have COVID. And like, ah, my warmth. Thomas, thank you. Yes, I've I've sensed my warmth. It's a great.
Very good. I'm glad.
Tell us, how can we learn more about your doings? When are you having your next workshop? Other than tomorrow in Budapest, because
Yes, so I'm teaching.
I won't
I'm
make
not
it from Mexico all the way to
exactly. So
Budapest.
I'm not doing so much in London. I will do a few things again because I've worked a lot in institutions. So I haven't really worked so much freelance in the UK in the last few years. Um, but I'm running a workshop in Budapest called Moving from Within at an organization called Workshop Foundation. We'll probably do another one. This one is coming up on this weekend. We'll do another one on the 25th and 27th and 28th of May
Hey,
at a theater space called Arcos. I'll be working in Barcelona with a organization called Obrador de Moviments on the 13th and 14th of May.
13th and 14th of May.
Of May. I'll be probably teaching a workshop in Dresden in Germany in June, the end of June. I can't remember. In July, I'm at the Dance and Somatic Conferences, Dance and Somatic Practice Conference. Please join us. It's a fantastic conference in Coventry. And there's a Zoom part of it as well. If you can't attend, try to join that conference. It's really fantastic place of cultural exchange. August, I'll have a holiday. September, I'll be teaching in Constance in first 3 days in September in Constance in Germany. Then I'll be going to Berlin to do a research project. Then at the end of September, I'll be probably teaching in Tenerife.
Tel Aviv.
And no, in Tenerife. Tenerife in
Spain.
Tenerife, in the Canary Islands. Then I'm going to go to Tel Aviv to do research project. Then I'm teaching in Darmstadt in Germany in November. So I have these kind of workshops. I'll probably do some more deep listening work with John Petter in London, and maybe teaching in London through a contact improvisation organization, which we're just setting up a project called CI at Goldsmiths.
Awesome.
And there's lots to read. I've written a lot. Some of it is interesting.
Yes, articles, plenty of them. Fascinating.
Yeah, and they're online. A lot of them are open access, so people can read them.
Yeah. So, do you have a website or
Yes, I do have. I have two websites. I have an old website which is more than 10 years old. It's called thomaskampe.com. It's not so great, but there's lots of art stuff on there. It's dated and it needs updating. I have a new one which is thomaskampe.wordpress.com. thomaskampe.wordpress.com, and I think it's called. That's what it's called. The first page is called Embodying Our Creative Selves.
Embodying Our Creative Selves.
So there's a website at Thomas Kampe I think it's at wordpress.com, or it's just wordpress.com.
Okay.
Which is my latest one, which has the workshops on there and a bit about my teaching, more about my teaching. The other one is more about the artwork.
Okay, so the one of your name, Thomas Kampe, is more on your trajectory as an artist, and the recent one, could you spell it like slowly, so they get to write it down?
Yes, so it's one of them is www.thomaskampe.com, and the other one is, I need to look it up. Just give me just one moment.
Yes.
Because I have it here. If I could only find it. Easily done. Let's just do something. It is called thomaskampe.wordpress.com.
thomaskampe.wordpress.org.
No, .com.
.com.
Yeah. It's thomaskampe.wordpress.com. That's the most recent one. It hasn't got anything on my research. There will be something about the research, and there will be something maybe about more recent artworks. But that has most recent information. I put it in the chat here. As well.
Got it. I'm gonna copy paste it down below. If you're watching on YouTube, just click right there. Thomas, I am so happy, honored, delighted of sharing this episode with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And it's been great having that dialogue through Facebook and Messenger with you.
Yeah.
You have my email.
Yeah, I have your email. We will keep in touch.
We will keep in touch. Great. And I want to hear more what you're doing as well.
Yeah, we'll keep you posted. And Essentialist, thank you for being here at the Sensual Sessions podcast with the one and only Thomas Kampe. And if you
Fantastic.
yeah, and if you haven't subscribed already to this podcast, please go to www.centrodepoder.com, however it would sound in English too. And until next time, please remember to sense your fire so you can share the flame.